Steel and the trade shock that shook North America, friends. What we are witnessing between the United States and Canada is not a routine trade dispute. It is a stress test of the entire North America economic architecture. For decades, the US and Canada built one of the most deeply integrated industrial systems in the world. Steel, energy, automobiles, aerospace, defense, and technology were never meant to function separately. They were designed to move seamlessly across a shared border. That is why the renewed use of tariffs, particularly under the banner of national security, has produced consequences far beyond political headlines. When the United States imposed new steel and aluminum tariffs on Canadian exports, the expectation in Washington may have been leverage. What followed instead was exposure. Canada did not respond with emotional rhetoric. It responded by signaling policy tools that strike at the structural dependencies of the US economy. Export reviews, strategic countermeasures, procurement diversification. None of these require dramatic announcements to have real impact. Markets understand them instantly. Within hours of tariff escalation, US industrial stocks reacted. Investors reassessed assumptions that had been treated as permanent, that Canada would always be a compliant supplier, that cross-border inputs would remain uninterrupted, that politics could not interfere with supply chains that took 70 years to build. Those assumptions were wrong. To understand why the reaction was so sharp, we must first understand how central Canada is to American industrial power. Canada is not a marginal steel supplier. It is the largest foreign supplier of steel and aluminum to the United States. Canadian steel feeds American auto plants, construction projects, pipelines, military manufacturing, and infrastructure renewal. Canadian aluminum is embedded in aircraft frames, electric vehicle batteries, packaging, and power transmission. But more importantly, Canada supplies specialized alloys. These are not commodities that can be replaced overnight. Aerospace-grade aluminum, high-strength steel for defense vehicles, precision alloys for EV motors and energy systems. The production of these materials is capital-intensive, slow to expand, and regulated for quality and security reasons. When Canada merely reviews the flow of these materials, it sends a signal that ripples through procurement departments, defense planners, and Wall Street analysts. This is why markets moved before any physical disruption occurred. The North American supply chain is not resilient in the way politicians often describe. It is efficient, optimized, and tightly synchronized. That makes it productive but also fragile. Disruption at one node creates cascading effects elsewhere. Consider the auto sector. Vehicles assembled in the United States often contain steel and aluminum that cross the US-Canada border multiple times before final assembly. Engines, frames, battery components, and electronic housings are produced in stages. A tariff or restriction at any stage increases cost for all downstream producers. That is why even the threat of disruption raises car prices. Not hypothetically, but mathematically. Input costs rise, financing costs rise, inventory buffers expand. All of that is passed on to consumers. The same logic applies to electric vehicles. EV production depends on lightweight alloys, high conductivity metals, and precise manufacturing tolerances. Canada plays a critical role not only in metals but also in upstream energy and critical minerals. Undermining that relationship, undermining competitiveness against Europe and Asia. Defense manufacturing is even more sensitive. Military supply chains prioritize reliability over cost. If a supplier becomes politically unreliable, procurement strategies change rapidly. This is why discussions around Canadian export reviews caught the attention of defense analysts. No official shortages were announced, but the concern was not immediate collapse. The concern was exposure. The realization that strategic autonomy cuts both ways. For decades, the United States benefited from Canada treating integration as a shared good. Canada rarely weaponized trade even when disputes arose. That restraint was not weakness, it was strategic patience. What has changed is the framing of trade as coercion. When tariffs are justified on national security grounds against a close ally, it forces that ally to reassess its own security assumptions. This is not about retaliation, it is about resilience. Canada's response fits a broader global pattern. Middle powers are no longer assuming stability from great powers. They are building optionality, diversifying suppliers, expanding partnerships, preserving leverage quietly rather than loudly. This is where steel becomes symbolic. Steel is foundational. It touches infrastructure, defense, transportation, and energy. If steel flows are uncertain, everything built on them becomes uncertain. Markets understand this instinctively. That is why US industrial stocks sold off. Not because Canada announced a ban, but because Canada reminded the system of its dependencies. For workers, this matters. Tariffs are often sold as protection for domestic jobs, but in integrated economies, tariffs act like taxes on production. When costs rise, firms delay investment, hiring slows, automation accelerates, the burden shifts downward. For pension funds and retirement accounts, volatility in industrial stocks and supply chain dependent sectors affects long term returns. Trade wars do not punish abstract entities, they affect household wealth. This is why Wall Street reacted faster than politicians. The political narrative often frames trade disputes as zero sum. One side wins, the other loses. Reality is more complex. In deeply integrated systems, disruption creates shared losses. That does not mean all outcomes are equal. Some actors adapt better than others. Those with diversified supply chains, strong institutions, and patient capital weather shocks better. Canada has advantages here. Its economy is smaller but flexible. Its trade strategy increasingly emphasizes diversification. Europe, Asia, strategic partnerships beyond North America. The United States has advantages too: scale, innovation, capital depth. But scale cuts both ways. When large systems move, they move slowly. This brings us to the strategic crossroads. There are three broad scenarios ahead. The first is de escalation. Tariffs are softened. Negotiations resume quietly. Trade irritants are managed rather than amplified. This outcome stabilizes markets and preserves competitiveness. The second is escalation. Tariffs expand. Countermeasures harden. Supply chains fragment. Costs rise structurally. North America loses ground relative to Asia and Europe. The third is strategic drift. No dramatic escalation but persistent uncertainty. Firms diversify gradually. Investment flows adjust slowly. Integration erodes without headlines. This is the most dangerous scenario because it is invisible until the damage is done. History suggests that economies rarely collapse from one decision. They weaken from accumulated friction. What makes this moment important is not steel alone. It is the signal that economic interdependence is being reinterpreted as vulnerability rather than strength. After 1945, Western economies built institutions to prevent exactly this dynamic. Trade was meant to bind interests so tightly that conflict became irrational. Weaponizing trade reverses that logic. Canada's actions do not represent hostility, they represent adaptation. By signaling control over strategic exports, Canada is reminding partners that sovereignty includes economic choices, that alliances function best when they are reciprocal, not coerced. For the United States, the lesson is uncomfortable but necessary. Leadership in an interconnected world is not enforced through pressure alone. It is maintained through predictability, trust, and mutual benefit. Markets understand this faster than governments because markets price risk, not rhetoric. The steel episode of 2026 will not be remembered for a single tariff line. It will be remembered as a moment when assumptions cracked, a moment when North America realized that integration can be fragile if treated casually, a moment when a middle power demonstrated that influence does not always require confrontation. Sometimes it requires reminding the system how it actually works. In the end, this is not about Canada versus the United States. It is about whether economic power is exercised with foresight or force. Steel may be forged in fire, but economies are sustained by trust. And once trust weakens, rebuilding it is far harder than imposing any tariff.